Chapter 1. My name is Arthur Gordon Pym. I was born in Nantucket, where my father ran a respectable sea supply business. My grandfather on my mother's side was a successful lawyer who had done well in business and managed to save a decent amount of money. He seemed to favor me over others in the family, and I expected to inherit much of his wealth after he passed. At 6, he sent me to the school of old Mr. Ricketts, a well-known teacher with only one arm who was quite eccentric. I attended his school until I turned 16, at which point I moved to Mr. E. Ronald's Academy on a hill. There, I became good friends with Augustus, the son of Captain Barnard, who sailed for Lloyd and Vradenburg, an influential family in New Bedford. Augustus was almost 2 years older than me and had gone whaling with his father aboard the John Donaldson. He often shared thrilling stories of his adventures in the South Pacific. I frequently spent time at their home, sometimes staying over and sharing a bed with Augustus, who would keep me up late with tales of the native people he encountered on various islands. I gradually became fascinated by his stories, and soon I had a strong desire to go to sea. I owned a small sailboat I called the Ariel, worth about $75. It had a cuddy cabin, and while I can't recall her exact size, it could fit about 10 people. We often embarked on crazy adventures that, looking back, I can hardly believe I'm still alive today. Let me recount one of those adventures as an introduction to my longer narrative. One night, there was a party at Mr. Barnard's house, and by the end, both Augustus and I were quite drunk. As usual, I opted to crash at his place instead of going home. When we crawled into bed around 1 in the morning, I thought he had fallen asleep without saying a word, unlike usual. About half an hour later, just as I was dozing off, he suddenly shot up and declared, with a curse, that he refused to sleep while there was such fine wind blowing in from the southwest. I was shocked and initially thought he was mad from too many drinks, but he insisted, coolly explaining that he wasn't drunk at all, he was simply tired of lying in bed when there was an adventure to be had. Without really knowing why, I felt a rush of excitement and agreed it was a fantastic idea. The wind was strong, and it was quite chilly for late October, but I jumped out of bed feeling energetic and willing to join his wild proposal. We quickly dressed and made our way to the boat, which was docked at a rundown wharf near the Pankey and Company lumber yard, rocking against the wooden logs. Augustus climbed in and started bailing out water that had filled the boat. Once that was done, we raised the sails and set out boldly into the open sea. The wind was brisk from the southwest, and the night was clear and cold. Augustus steered while I stationed myself by the mast on deck. We sped along without exchanging a word after leaving the wharf. I finally asked Augustus where we were headed and when he thought we might return. He merely replied in an annoyed tone, "I'm going to sea. You can head back if you want." I noticed his unusual tension. Despite trying to play it cool, he was clearly agitated. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he held the tiller. Recognizing something was wrong, I got worried. I didn't have much boating knowledge and relied on Augustus completely. The wind was picking up as we sailed away from land, but I didn't want to seem scared. I kept quiet for almost half an hour. Eventually, I felt compelled to suggest we turn back, but he took his time responding. "Soon, home soon," he finally said, but there was a dreadful weight in his voice. I looked closely at him. His lips were pale, and he appeared to be trembling uncontrollably. "What's wrong, Augustus?" I cried, genuinely frightened. "What's the matter?" "Nothing's wrong," he mumbled in surprise, letting go of the tiller and collapsing into the bottom of the boat. "Nothing. Going home, don't you see?" The truth hit me hard. I rushed to him and realized he was completely drunk, unable to stand, speak, or even see. His glazed eyes were a clear sign of his state. As despair settled in, he rolled into the water I had just lifted him from. I was gripped by terror. The alcohol had worn off for me, making me more anxious and unsure. I knew I couldn't manage the boat alone, and the strong wind and current were pulling us toward trouble. A storm was moving in. We had no compass or supplies, and I realized we would likely drift out to sea before dawn if we didn't change course. My mind raced with fear as I felt frozen in indecision. Despite the chaos, the boat managed to stay steady. I took a moment to calm myself, even as the wind turned fierce. Just then, a loud, terrifying scream pierced the night, making my hair stand on end and my heart stop. Without a clear thought, I collapsed on top of my friend, unconscious. When I regained consciousness, I found myself in the cabin of a large whaling ship, the Penguin, heading to Nantucket. Several crew members were around me, and Augustus was by my side, pale and overjoyed to see me awake. They explained we had been struck by the whaling ship while it was sailing to Nantucket at full speed. Their lookout hadn't seen us until it was too late. Our boat had been so small that it was as if the Penguin had just sailed over it. The captain had initially wanted to ignore it, thinking it was just some driftwood, but two crew members insisted they had seen me at the helm. A heated discussion ensued, with the first mate demanding they turn back to rescue us. Fortunately, both Augustus and I were saved, a stroke of fate many people would attribute to divine intervention. As the ship turned back, the mate launched a small boat with two crew members to search for us. They encountered the Ariel's remains and unexpectedly found Augustus, who was clinging to a piece of debris. Thanks to the rope I had tied around him to keep him upright in the boat, he was buoyed by the floating wreckage. Augustus was a mess when he was finally brought on board. He recalled feeling himself being dragged under, desperately fighting to keep afloat while struggling against the rope around his neck. He lost consciousness after hitting his head, only to wake later, confused and in the water. He had managed to hold on to the floating debris until the crew found him, but the experience would haunt him for a long time. As for me, I was revived after nearly 3.5 hours of resuscitation efforts, thanks to vigorous rubbing with hot oil, a method suggested by Augustus. My wounds, though serious-looking, weren't fatal, and soon I was back to normal. The Penguin arrived at port around 9 in the morning. Both Augustus and I made it to Mr. Barnard's for breakfast, just in time, luckily avoiding any scrutiny from our friends, who were too fatigued to notice our disheveled appearances. We often reflect on that terrifying night, realizing how close we came to disaster. Augustus admitted that he had never felt such dread as he did when he understood the full extent of his drunkenness while out on our little boat.